In today's episode of the Swiss BioTalk, I had the pleasure of speaking with Kelvin Stott. Kelvin has over 20 years of leadership experience within the life science industry. He has experience within academia, consulting, biotech, venture capital, and large pharma. Kelvin is currently the CEO and founder of Amporin Pharmaceuticals, an award-winning biotech focused on developing small molecule drugs for the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. I hope you enjoy the following conversation. Kelvin, really appreciate taking the time to speak to me today. Just to start off with, like I like to do with people, is find out a bit more about their origin story. You initially studied biochemistry at the University of Sussex. What drew you into the subject?
I liked science in general. I mean, I studied biology and chemistry at school, so it was a natural combination of those. And as you do at those times, you look through university prospectuses, and I looked through several courses at several universities, and in the end, I chose to study biochemistry at Sussex because it was one of the few courses in biochemistry where you could choose to do it in the School of Chemistry or in the School of Biology. So I preferred the direction of coming from chemistry because I always thought you could explain more complex things as long as you understand the fundamentals. So actually, when I began that course many years ago, the first courses were in quantum mechanics and physics, and then explaining chemistry in terms of quantum mechanics, and then explaining organic chemistry in terms of general chemistry, and then biology, biochemistry in terms of chemistry. So it was a nice way to understand a rather complex thing as biochemistry from the fundamentals of chemistry and physics.
No, of course, yeah. And I guess if you're able to explain something in the quantum aspect, then surely it should get easier trying to explain stuff in other ways. Is that right to say?
Yeah, you get it. I mean, I always feel that biology is people are sort of showing blobs interacting with other blobs, and I always found that intellectually uh, unsatisfying because unless you really have an image and a picture and an understanding of what is really going on inside those blobs and how they're actually interacting in terms of the chemistry, the molecular structures, the intermolecular forces, and the physics behind those forces, um, it 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 felt a little bit superficial.
That's been interesting. And after that, you continued to get a PhD in neuroscience and biomolecular engineering as well from the University of Cambridge. If you were to sum up your experience there, how did you find the experience? Obviously, going to such a prestige academic university.
Yeah, I mean, it was very different. Sussex was fantastic. It was a kind of campus in the middle of the South Downs in the south of the UK, so a very rural country park and a very protected campus kind of environment. Cambridge is it's also Sussex is also quite a modern university built in the 60s. And Cambridge obviously is a bit older than that with hundreds and hundreds of years of history, but also based and integrated within the city of Cambridge. So it was quite a different environment to be there, but also, with the history, the legacy, the number of Nobel laureates, the cutting edge of the science that is going on there, was going on there, and has been going on there for years and years. The big names behind that. I mean, it's just awe-inspiring. So I would, recommend anyone who has the opportunity to spend a bit of time in a place like that, whether it's Oxford, Cambridge, or a really old, prestigious university, try everything to do that for the experience because it really opens your mind up and it connects you with other people who are, extremely curious and bright as well. But the passion of trying big new ideas burn brighter there than many other places I've had the privilege to encounter.
And then just going into your first role within the industry after receiving your PhD, you first joined McKinsey as a consultant within the pharma industry. What was your first impression of the industry from a consultant's point of view?
Well, actually, there was a little bit of a story behind that. I mean, at Cambridge, I developed a technology, um, uh, and I've always been interested in the application of science, not so much science for the sake of it, but the impact science can have, and that's ultimately why I ended up in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry because of the impact on health. Um, and based on my research at Cambridge, I'd tried to form a startup company. This was back in around 2000 at the end of a research fellowship that continued after my PhD. And at the time, the dot-com bubble had just burst, so it was difficult to raise funding. I had absolutely no business experience. There were questions over who owned the actual IP I'd developed. It certainly wasn't me, but whether it was the college, the MRC, the laboratory, etc., it was quite a different time. Now, technology transfer offices are much more streamlined and experienced in dealing with those things. But I wanted to form this startup at that time, but because of these barriers, I needed to address those. And regarding the lack of business experience, I felt that joining McKinsey was a great way to go in at the deep end, learn fast, and also have the possibility to make a big impact with clients. So I was lucky to work with big pharmaceutical company clients on projects centered around research and development and innovation, um, doing post-merger integration of R&D, looking at things like R&D productivity and performance management and how to measure innovation, quality and quantity. And these have always been interesting questions since those days that have stuck with me, throughout my career. So, in terms of how was McKinsey as an experience, obviously it's very different from academia. It's still pretty intellectual in terms of solving problems for clients, but much more collaboration and team focus, much more focus on, communications and making an impact, and yeah, soft skills as well, that in a laboratory you don't necessarily develop to the same extent.
And then afterwards, another thing that sort of quite unique that stood out to me from your experiences going from consulting, starting biotech. You've also experienced working within a VC, as well as large pharma companies, and starting your own biotech as well. What stands out to you in the biggest difference in regards to mindset strategy across those industries?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a journey. I tell my kids I still haven't quite figured out what I want to do when I grow up. So I've kind of hopped around between big companies, small companies, consulting, pharma, biotech, venture capital, etc. And part of it is because I still haven't figured out what I want to do, but also because we are one society, but this is also one industry, and to see it's all about innovation and delivering new healthcare products, medicines, etc., to make a difference. Um, but you can only really understand that industry when you see things from different perspectives. And it's a very fragmented industry with your biotechs, with your big pharma companies. There's also all the CROs and regulatory authorities. There's probably many more places I could have ended up as well. Um, but moving around these different parts of the industry gave me a nice kind of multi-perspective view of how the industry fits together, the challenges as well as the opportunities to make a difference. But other than that, of course, the main differences between big companies and small companies. Bigger companies are usually so much better resourced, but obviously with a lot more bureaucracy, inertia, possibly politics as well, although you get that in small companies to an extent as well. And but as well, big companies tend to have a lot of inertia. So it can, if you like, innovation being disruptive, breaking new ground as I do, it can also be a little bit frustrating. So there's a sort of lesson in humility and understanding. To make an impact in a big company, you have to do it incrementally, bit by bit, and there's a lot of stakeholder management involved in that. So there are big differences between big and small companies. Consulting is also very different to working within a company. Obviously, in consulting, you're working for the consultancy company, but in a sense, you're delivering value to your clients. So everything is about delivering impact for the clients. It's a very customer-focused industry. Whereas perhaps in pharma, biotech, especially in R&D, yes, it's ultimately about making a difference to patients, but it's also very far upstream. You're working in the science where the medicines that come out of that process may not do so for 10, 15 years, by which time you've moved on. And in many cases, they never make it there at all because of the high risks and the issues with safety and efficacy that are tested throughout the development process. It's a very high reward but high risk environment.
No, absolutely, and that kind of brings me on perfectly to my next question. With bio, that's one thing that does intrigue me about the biotech industry is the chance of success are quite low in the grand scheme of things. Raising funds is crucial to be able to progress to the next stage and eventually to commercialize.
Indeed.
From a VC point of view, from a VC perspective, what advice would you give to those working in biotechs that are currently raising funds?
Well, often it's too late for many of them because many of the biotechs tend to my experience, especially academic spin-outs, they develop a great technology or solution, often for a problem that doesn't exist, or in many cases where there are perfectly satisfactory solutions to those problems already. So the first bit of advice before even thinking about forming a startup is make sure you start with the problem and that there is a kind of big or urgent unmet need that you're addressing. It's all about the problem and whose problem it is, the customers. And then, of course, if you have a better solution than is available, not just technically, but thinking about traction in the market and changes in people's behaviors to get your solution adopted. So that's the first thing. Always start with where's the pain, what the big problem is, and have a good understanding of that and how that problem is currently being addressed. And understand the roadmap that you will need to take your solution to get traction in the market and make a difference. I think that's the biggest part of it. Of course, there's a lot of it in having a great team, experienced team who've proven they can execute and deliver, which is not always easy for a young biotech startup coming as a spin out of academia, for example. But there's a lot of passion and energy, on the other hand, that you can also capitalize there. But otherwise, it's still important to bring experienced advisors, mentors in and around you, firstly to add credibility, but also to open doors and make sure you're, not making mistakes that either they've made before or have seen others make before. So, problem, solution, team, execution, and commitment. So I saw a LinkedIn article recently, and I think it was a quote by Mark Zuckerberg, and he said the reason why startups, win sometimes, not always, there's still a high failure rate, is because they have early conviction and they can execute fast, and those are the keys. So if from a venture capital perspective, if you see the size of the problem, the pain, and the potential value of the solution, And then the team is able to execute fast and has the passion, the commitment, and is, making sacrifices and putting skin in the game. That's a big part of it as well. So these are all things you look for from a venture capital perspective. Now I'm on the other side, raising funds for a new company, so hopefully these are coming into place as well.
No, of course, yeah, and that's very interesting you mentioned that. It's one of the things from speaking to numerous people is an issue with biotech is, for example, the founders might be very scientifically minded, they have a great technology, but one thing that they can lack, or one problem, is the business acumen. And I think what you highlighted there makes perfect sense from a venture capital point of view. They've got the business mindset, okay, how does this solve an issue? Whereas beforehand, whether the technology is great, how applicable is it to like the wider group? So it makes perfect sense to me. So I haven't thought about that. With that being quite a blind spot, well, for me, a blind spot anyways, do you see any other blind spots or lessons that you feel like that you've learned that might have not been easy to come across unless you've experienced it?
I think, well, maybe through experience, I'm very fortunate with my current startup. We have a small but very experienced and team with fantastic chemistry. And it's really, really important that you have very good team dynamics. I mean, yes, on paper you need the complementary skills, and over time make sure you need to cover the gaps either through your founders in the technical expertise or the business acumen and know-how, etc., experience and execution, or at least try to fill those gaps temporarily with advisors, consultants, mentors, etc. But above all that, the team dynamics and having the right personal chemistry is really, really important. And starting a company is very different from just doing a kind of 9 to 5 normal job in a bigger company, where yes, you've got to turn up and deliver, because you've got so much more at stake. You're putting skin in the game, and with a small startup, and passion. There is a lot of passion there as well. So and if things don't go right, that passion has a danger of blowing up and founders not seeing eye to eye, etc. So you've got to choose people that you enjoy the journey with. Yes, you want to get to the end result, ideally an exit, of products on the market, etc., a successful company. And that's what's kind of driving you forwards. But you've got to love the journey that you're taking with the people you're taking that journey with. And, have a sense of humility and humor on the way. And it won't always go right, but it's when it doesn't go right that you really find out who those people you enjoy that journey is with.
Makes absolute sense. Yeah, I think that's quite a good overall sort of golden rule to follow. Is team is very important. The people you work with on a day-to-day basis as well. And just before we get into your current sort of company and what you're doing, one thing I'm quite curious about is you posted an article on LinkedIn, I think around 2018, and correct me if my interpretation of it is wrong, but essentially it was you highlighted the decline of the rate of return within pharma due to the decline of R&D productivity. With it being almost 7 years ago since you've made that post, has your perception of the trend changed, or do you still see it going in the same direction?
Yeah, so just to recap and give a bit of context to that. I mean, having worked in the industry for many, many years, you just hear from people and discussions, and what you read is that the industry is, unlike the glory days in the maybe 60s, 70s, 80s, where there was a high output of new drugs which make a huge difference. Over time, that's got harder and harder, and as more and more investment exponentially is being put into drug discovery and development, then you look at the output of that, the number of new drugs and the incremental value and benefit to patients of those new drugs is diminishing as the investment is going up. So when you look at this as a kind of efficiency, look at the overall efficiency or return on investment of the industry, what you get out versus what you put in, there were signs that it's declining over time. So about that time, a few years ago, I decided to kind of question that, look at the data, and figure out to what extent is that really true. And indeed, if you look over the past 40, 50, 60 years at the return on investment or productivity of the industry, it's almost a straight line decline. And this may surprise a lot of people outside of the industry, because there's, over the course of that time period, there's been huge amounts of technological breakthroughs, genome sequencing, proteomics, genomics, combinatorial chemistry, high throughput screening, all these so-called breakthrough technologies that at the time were purported to be game changers in the efficiency and productivity of what the pharmaceutical industry is delivering. But contrary to all those views, this trend has been declining over time. So I decided to look into the reasons for that, and posted some analysis, and maybe you can share the links to that separately. They're on my LinkedIn page anyway. But the outcome of that was to question how sustainable this is as an industry, and try to shape people into thinking not just about what the next new drug will be, but what the next new R&D model will be for the industry. Now, since then, there's been a few upticks and blips. Actually, with the COVID pandemic, there was quite an uptick in the productivity of the industry as resources went in, and there was a huge effort to develop these new vaccines for COVID, which were ultimately very successful and quickly successful. That's the point when the industry all worked together to address this huge challenge. But now that challenge is over, and we're kind of back to the current or the previous historic trend of declining R&D productivity. So it is tough times in the industry. It's not getting easier. Every time you develop a new drug, you raise the bar for the next drug, which makes it more costly, more risky to find something better. And it reduces the scope of the potential improvement beyond what's already out there. So this is an ongoing trend, and I don't think that will go away. But just to put it into perspective, this is exactly what many industries go through, is a sort of diminishing returns, and then at some point an entire industry evolves into something completely different. So the pharmaceutical industry came from the bulk or the specialty chemicals industry, which itself came from the bulk chemicals industry. Now all of these things are commoditized in high volumes and low margins. And I think that's where ultimately the pharma and biotech industry will go. But in its place, I think there's a good chance that new technologies in cell and gene therapy, especially regenerative medicine, the possibility of growing new organs, can open up potentially a whole new industry at the time when, pharma and biotech may be fading. So this is just the natural progression of science and development of a civilization, if you will.
No, of course, yeah, that's very interesting. You mentioned that, and apart from the regenerative of organs, where else do you see this industry shifting to? Where else do you see, like, sort of, as you mentioned, the evolution of this industry going into?
Yeah, there's a general trend. I mentioned pharma industry, even the biotech industry, which is mostly around complex protein therapeutics, antibodies, etc. Before that, you had the small molecule drugs which were active biologically. Before that, the specialty chemicals, the dyes, and so on, the bulk chemicals. Now, if you look where that trend has been, it's always been about increasing the complexity of the solution. Right. So as you go
Yeah.
from simple bulk chemicals like how to make ammonia to specialty chemicals and then antibiotics, small molecule drugs, and then complex biologicals, and now we're moving into cell and gene therapies using whole cells. There's a trend of increasing complexity in finding solutions to the next new problem. And I think that trend will continue, which is why I believe, at some point we'll end up with regenerative medicine, looking at the organ level or at least the tissue level rather than just the cell level or the gene level, proteins, etc.
Mm. And have you noticed with the implementation and I guess the explosion of AI in not only sort of day-to-day life and actually in professional settings as well, have you noticed this being a accelerant for this or accelerating the progress within the industry to be able to reach those
Yes
conclusions?
and no. I think there's a huge amount of hype and investment going into AI right now, and I mean, I think no one can deny it. It has blown a lot of people away, just kind of what it has been able to do already. Not all of it useful in terms of creating images and the kind of stuff that circulates on social media. But at the same time, what we have seen are, huge advances in things like drafting, reviewing complex documents, legal agreements, summarizing scientific papers, understanding, the field of the collective knowledge of science across all the literature and publications, and just the power of it to analyze data and draw inferences from that. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. Um, but there's a limit to that. What AI is ultimately is it's a statistical tool, and it's great at interpolating between the existing body of data points. But what it's not so good at is extrapolating beyond the current scope of data points. For that, there's no substitution than running an experiment. With AI, yes, there's a huge amount of data, but there's also a problem with garbage in, garbage out. If you put rubbish, no matter how much data you have, if 50% of it is junk, the quality of the data coming out it will only be as good as that, and 50% junk. It cannot create new information.
Mm.
It can only process the data and information that we already have. And again, if a large part of it is junk, then you will get junk out. My concern actually is that AI will churn out a lot of junk and noise, and that itself will get it will get published and fed back into AI. So I worry that there will be a gradual deterioration of signal to noise in the quality of information we have available. I mean, at the moment, I think only 50% or maybe even 40% of scientific publications are reproducible.
Mm.
Half of them or so are not, possibly junk, and we don't even know which 50% at this point. So if you think about that junk being recycled into itself, I worry that we'll lose quality of information over time with a huge increase in the quantity, but a reduction in the quality.
No, it's a very interesting point because I also spoke with someone recently who I think he went to a conference and is in regards to AI and extrapolating results from trials. And one of the points they made is some experiments aren't published as well, so therefore we cannot use the information that's not published. Which, as you mentioned, yeah, there's only a limited amount that it can.
Yeah, there's a survivorship bias in science. Everyone kind of is, I think, aware of this, which is if you get a negative result, it's not so attractive for the journals to publish. It's not so attractive for or interesting for people to read necessarily. But but actually having negative information, if you're looking at, machine learning and AI, knowing what doesn't work is just as valuable and important to know as knowing what does work.
No, absolutely. It's like learning from people or learning from mistakes or learning from people's mistakes. You need to take that story away. But no, that's a very interesting point. But in regards to what you're currently doing, so you've set up Amporin Pharmaceuticals last year, I believe, or nearly 2 years ago now.
Yeah, the idea was germinating for a bit longer than that, since 2021 or 2022. And the idea was sort of supported by myself investing in a bit of my personal savings into testing some ideas, which came back positive. But around this time, so April last year, decided to form the company and create the startup. Reached out and pulled in two co-founders who are fantastic, Hervé Schaffhauser, Daniel Umbrecht, both formerly from Roche. I was previously at Novartis for a while. So as a company, we're based in Basel, Switzerland, and we are focused on developing small molecule drugs for the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases.
Oh, fantastic. And since then, I think you won several awards already, and you're representing Switzerland in a competition that's coming up. Is that right to
Yeah,
say?
it's nice to it's nice to have a bit of recognition, because it is, a lot of hard work and graft in doing and building what we're doing, and we got recognition, partly with some initial seed funding, convertible loans that we got from Venture Kick and Kick Funds. So these are sort of philanthropic funds to help startups in Switzerland. It's a great environment for startups here. But also we got recognized as a so-called Venture Leader Biotech 2025. So this is a selection of 10 biotech companies that are representing the best biotech startups of Switzerland, and will be going on a roadshow at the end of June to
Well, congratulations. Yeah. No, it's very, very exciting. So, in regards to your current situation, what is, obviously, from whatever you can disclose, what's the current position you're in, and what's the next steps for the
Yeah, first
organization?
priority is fundraising. Now, we raised really a tiny bit of funds, 250,000, pre-seed or pre-seed funding and convertible loans, and we've pretty much invested all that into generating more data to validate our technology as much as we can at this stage. But now we need to use that data and to help raise further funds so we can generate more data. It's always a cycle of investment in developing a technology, testing it, generating data, and using that to de-risk the technology and show its potential is closer than it was before, and convince new investors to invest more money that we can invest back into more. So that's where we are now. We're looking to raise, a bigger round of seed funding to take us ideally to the clinic, and then we'll need to raise more funding to take us through the clinic.
Mm. No, absolutely. And one thing I sort of noticed by looking at the investment trends, it seems like over the last couple of years within Switzerland, there's more investment going into, let's say, Series B or progresses that are a bit more further down the line rather than sort of seed funding. Have you noticed that trend, and has it been a bit more difficult to go over those concerns or the investor hesitancy?
Yes, it's definitely a changed market dynamic. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more uncertainty in the world for a number of reasons we don't need to mention, particularly at the moment. As I say, ironically, COVID times was a sort of golden period for raising funds, because there was this urgent problem that needed to be addressed, and there was a lot of investment available to tackle these things. But in the last sort of three or 4 years since then, the investor appetite for risk has diminished markedly, and the appetite to invest in new early stage tech companies has come down substantially. Probably it's still around the same level as it was before COVID. But at the same time, the investments are looking are moving later in the life cycle of a company. So it's tougher for a new startup at this moment to raise funds, whereas more developed companies are able to raise bigger rounds later on. But this is always the market dynamics and the cycles of the funding. It's a bit like watching a traffic jam in the road, where you get these caterpillars of cars bunching up, and then suddenly they take off and there's space, and then they come to a stop again. These things, funding is not the most fluid and efficient system. It gets bunched up from time to time.
Okay, it's very, very interesting analogy there. What would you say some of the biggest challenges have been that you face throughout your career?
Partly it's kind of still knowing really what I want to do ultimately. I've always chased opportunities for two reasons. One is curiosity, and two is an impact, an opportunity to make a difference. And as I think I alluded to before, that hasn't always been easy in startups, because you rely on raising funding in times that may be difficult to get funding, whereas in bigger companies there's a lot of inertia, and making a difference with innovation is not always the easiest thing. If you've got kind of bold, disruptive ideas, big companies don't necessarily support those ideas internally. So you have to sort of take a more cautious and incremental approach to fit in. But those are mostly the challenges I've faced. It's almost an impatience or frustration. I wish the world would change faster, and it doesn't.
Of course, no, some things take very slow burners. And is there anything that you wish you learned earlier in your career that you feel like has been a big game changer within your perception or the way you do your work, essentially?
There is a big lesson I've kind of learned, but still don't really apply as I should, which is it's not necessarily, hard work is important, and having bright ideas or putting in effort is of course important, but visibility and branding, marketing, how you're perceived by others, by investors, by your boss, by other stakeholders. You can't do anything in this world alone. And we are all humans, and we make our decisions based on our perceptions. And if you're working in a dark room really hard all hours, it's not necessarily going to be seen or rewarded. It is important to get out there, connect with people, network with people, and I'm still guilty. I don't make enough time for that.
No, very interesting. And I don't know if that kind of relates to this next question, but as like sort of to kind of wrap us up with words of wisdom for those earlier on in their career or sort of beginning their professional career, what advice would you give, or what words of wisdom would you want to share?
Same as I tell my kids, which is just follow your passion and try to be useful and make it, a difference. Get on with people, that's really important. But above all, follow your curiosity and your passion. Do what you love to do, what you love to learn, and enjoy the ride as you go. But yes, at the same time, try to be useful to people, to society, and make a difference.
Oh, no, fantastic. Lovely words of wisdom there. But look, Kevin, I really appreciate the time you've taken to speak with me. I hope other people are listening will get some very useful insights from what you've shared. As mentioned, I will put a link to the article that you mentioned as well to your LinkedIn profile and your company website for us to check out. As you mentioned, sort of visibility is key, and especially when you are going through fundraising, I think it also helps highlighting what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. Thank you for the chat.
Pleasure was mine, and I hope you have a good upcoming weekend.